Well, today on The Yarn, we have Professor Steve Hamilton from George Washington University. Now, Steve is an Australian who's been in the US for a couple of years now. G'day, Steve.
G'day, Andrew. How are you, mate?
Good. Now, where are you from in Australia?
I was born in Toowoomba in Queensland, but I grew up on the Sunshine Coast. Do you know the Sunshine Coast? It's kind of, a
Isn't that
Budrum is where I
Noosa?
went to school.
Yeah.
Uh, fancy people say Noosa. It's kind of like the Sunshine Coast has a bit of a division between, most of the Sunshine Coast down south and then Noosa up north. But yeah, no, Noosa's a beautiful place. So I grew up there, and then I moved to Brisbane to go to uni at UQ, and then moved to Canberra, and then moved to the US.
So, how did you end up at George Washington George Washington University in Washington?
Yeah, so I was at Treasury for a few years, and I felt like I wanted to go. I felt a bit unsatisfied, as a public servant. I felt a bit kind of limited, and there's all sorts of things you can't do as a public servant. And if you've seen me write or speak publicly, you'll know I don't like to be constrained. And so I decided to go and study a PhD in economics, and sort of the best place to do that is in the US. So I went to the University of Michigan, and I did my PhD there from 2012 to 2018. And then when I finished that, I decided I thought I might like to be an academic, and so I ended up getting a job in Washington. And as a person who loves policy, right, as somebody who loves tax policy specifically, but policy generally, DC is just an amazing place to be, right? So all sorts of amazing people here, great kind of institutions. My university is across the street from the IMF and the World Bank, and down the street from the Fed, and I have all sorts of interactions with US policy people. So, as an Australian in the US, it's a pretty cool place to live. Yeah.
Yeah, so to the uninitiated, Steve is a prolific writer for the Australian Financial Review, but also what I would call, in kind of old-fashioned language, a bit of a public intellectual in economics. And as an Australian, I guess you take a particular interest in what's happening here, even though you're over there. So how do you keep track of what's happening back home?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are a couple of modes. A lot of Australians move to the US and they kind of never look back, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I think Jonathan Swan, a journalist, right, from used to be on the Insider's Couch and worked for the Sydney Morning Herald. I think now he works for the New York Times, and he's an American citizen now, and I think he seems to know the US as the biggest marketplace in the world, and he's jumped in and off he goes, right? That's a pretty normal mode of Australian expats. But I have to be honest, Andrew, ever since I've been here, I felt a really deep, unbreakable connection to Australia. And it's funny. I mean, I just don't care as much about American policy. I just never have. It's never kind of captured my sort of passion, I think, because I really deeply care about Australia. And so every piece of research I've ever done, even here, has been on Australia. And so I just keep, I read all the same newspapers you read, but, it's in the afternoon when they become available. And again, I have a big history in Australian policy. And so I have the knowledge there. You could do cutting edge research on Australian policy. At the end of the day, Australia is what I love and what I care about. And so, I've been able to manage this kind of, stepping on two sides of the fence, as it were,
Well, I think with the Olympics, we're reminded of how great Australia is. And
yes,
I often worry that we're not very patriotic, or as patriotic as we used to be, and we should be.
Yes.
But that was an opportunity to refresh everyone's memory about how good we actually are compared to everyone else.
Well, at most things except breakdancing, not the best.
That is true.
So, no, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think you look at that medal tally and you say, now let's do it in per capita terms. And Australia's miles ahead of any other country in the world. So I think we should be very proud of that. And I tell you, when you meet Australians overseas, it's the greatest thing ever. Like, you're walking around in DC and you hear the Australian accent and you're kind of, oh, hang on, what was that? It's a great thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, although I do think that for the record, we should actually put on record that the Kiwis also did pretty well, I think, this time in
Yeah,
per
no,
capita
okay.
terms.
Per capita, well, we can figure out some other way to push New Zealand down the list. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Now look. This podcast series is going to be about housing,
Yeah.
because one of the jobs that I have back here, or maybe the main job I have back here, is to work on housing policy. So why don't you give us your view about Labor's housing policy? They've had 2.5 years. I'd be interested to hear what you think they've done well, what they could have done better.
Yeah. So let me step back a little bit. I mean, I would say housing is the single most important economic issue in the world. I think it's easily the single most important economic issue in Australia. And not just economic, right? Importantly, economically, and I'm an economist, that's what I care about. But it also is important in any number of dimensions, right? That's sociological, in terms of people's welfare, the degree of homelessness that we have as a function of housing policy, for example, right? The lived experience of people, the way our cities function, the way how satisfied people feel in their jobs, in their lives, in their friendships, in their kids' friendships. This housing issue is, had for many years been, I think, underestimated. And recently, I think a lot of people are starting to realize just how important it is. I live in Washington, one of the most expensive housing markets in the US. It's not just rent that's expensive. It's the cost of groceries. If you came here to DC and I took you down to the local grocery store, nothing fancy, you would be staggered at how expensive basic groceries are. Why?
Yeah.
Well, where do those groceries sit? Those groceries sit on land, right? They sit on land that's very expensive, right? So the employees who stack the shelves need to be paid a wage that can afford the high rents, right? So this housing cost thing, this land cost, it just pervades everything. And so I think, I'm very glad for a long time that you've been someone who's been very interested in this topic. And it's just, I cannot overstate how important it is. And I think that's why it has become, the most important issue in Australian politics, right? So yeah, I would just start with that proviso, right? I think people out there need to understand just how important this issue is. Now,
well,
government policy,
I guess it's always been important, right? Because it was really what Menzies put at the centre of his offering back in the 40s. So It's always been the idea of private home ownership has always been part of the Liberal Party's kind of core offering. And I guess Labor would argue potentially that they also believe in it. I would argue that the contemporary Labor Party have policies which tend to suggest that they're more interested in corporate housing. But anyway, do you have a view about how successful Labor has been in the last 2.5 years on housing?
Yeah, so I think it's become an issue lately, obviously, because the price of housing has gone out of control.
Yeah.
Now, not just in Australia, in a lot of places, here in the US, in Canada, a lot of countries have experienced this. Now, I don't think politicians, certainly not in Australia, but I think in many places, have been sufficiently responsive to this problem, and I think that's very clear in Australia. So I would say, when I look at the broad policies that the Australian government has put up, I see it as sort of wildly insufficient for the task and for the importance of the issue economically, right? So if I look at the housing accord, if I look at the rhetoric, I look at the various offerings, it honestly is a drop in the ocean compared to, I think, what we need, which is it needs to be the number one priority of the government, and they need to do extraordinary things in order to turn the dial. And until they do, I think we're not going to get any kind of real solution that'll meaningfully affect housing affordability.
It's interesting because, like any other market, I mean, I know I'm talking to a PhD in economics here, so this will be an obvious point to make, but there is a supply side and there's a demand side. So on the supply side, the government has had a policy of having housing targets and having a Housing Australia Future Fund, which is designed to build a number of what they call social and affordable houses, which I sort of find is a bit of a nebulous term. I mean, in the old days, governments would build public housing, and I sort of imagine that if the government was building public housing today, like they did in the Menzies era, then you could kind of haul these people before Senate estimates and ask them about the quality of the housing, why they haven't built houses, and so on and so forth. I sort of feel like it's very hard to pin them down on these issues.
Yeah, so I would say the overall number of houses is just too small. If we commit to 20,000 houses, it's like you're out by an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
We need to seriously increase the total stock. Now, the problem is if you have a binding constraint in the housing market, which we have on supply, it doesn't matter how many houses the government wants to build, right? I mean, the government could say tomorrow we're going to build 100,000 houses. They could say we're going to build 1 million houses.
Yeah, well, that's what they've done.
Councils don't let you build them.
Well, that's actually what they've done. They said they're going to build 1.2 million houses, but they've got no chance of doing that.
You've got a supply curve that's vertical. It doesn't matter what you do, right? So I think that the issue is if you say that we're going to build 10,000 affordable houses, well, then that just means there's fewer houses for everyone else. Ultimately, we have to deal with this fundamental problem of supply, and everything else is a kind of a rounding error without dealing with that direct problem. And yes, I see Labor has, I see suggestions that Labor is going to offer incentives to try and get governments to build more housing, to free up more supply, to rezone. They're way too small. They don't go anywhere near the kind of building the kind of leverage that the federal government could impose if it wanted to. So I sort of look at it as, and I guess this is important for people at home to understand, housing supply has what an economist would call kind of positive externalities, right? Which is a local area chooses to build a house. It doesn't just benefit them. It benefits everybody.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have these really small areas where people in these local suburbs are completely determining what happens in that local suburb, NIMBYism, you could call it, preventing building in that suburb, they're thinking about their suburb, but they're not thinking about the nation, right? And if if every single suburb on its own said, no, we don't want any more houses, then no one gets more houses. And then we have an aggregate problem that's a housing crisis and an economy that has a kind of speed limit on it, a seriously tight speed limit, right? Because we aren't building, right? So I would say the biggest problem in the housing market, which I don't think the government has come close to solving, is this issue of aligning the incentives of local governments and the nation. Now, that is literally the purpose of the federal government, right? Why do we have a federal government? We have a federal government because there are some problems that need to be fixed in a national context, right? So I think, we need to gear government policy around effectively, I mean, I don't know what words you want to use, whether it be override, but state governments have to have an incentive, as they are doing right now in Sydney, for example, to some degree. That hasn't been perfect, but I think they're moving in the right direction to basically prevent local residents from vetoing what we should think of as nationally significant infrastructure, right? Which is our housing stock.
So in terms of that NIMBYism poison, I mean, my sense is that the federal government has done nothing to apply pressure to councils to approve developments. And I sort of think after 2.5 years of being in government, you would think that they would understand that, and I'm understanding this better and better every day, that so often it is the case that a local council will destroy a development just because it's been subject to pressure by people that have more time on their hands and people that are working or people that are busy with
Absolutely.
their lives.
I mean, when you get a car park that gets heritage listed, we have to say to ourselves, this system is not working for anybody. I mean, it is not in the nation's interest that car parks be heritage listed, right? So, I would say, now it is true. We have to be kind of realistic about this. I think the federal government, does not build houses. I mean, more or less, right? This is not really, so we have to think about what the role of the federal government is here. And I would argue the federal government hands the state governments, hundreds of billions of dollars a year in cash because they have the main revenue raising power.
Yeah.
And so the state governments rely on the federal governments substantially for their financial viability. And the state governments have full control over local governments. Full 100% control. So if the state government wants to override any local government decision, they can do that under the Constitution, right? So, I would argue the role of the federal government can be best in that financial relationship with the states to incentivize the state governments to generate the houses that we need. And I think the government could use being a lot more creative.
Yeah.
And get a lot more lead behind its arrow in dialing up those incentives. There's carrots. The government's offered some tiny, tiny carrots. I don't think that comes close to enough. But the federal government also has a big stick. When we go to come up with a funding agreement on health or education with state governments, the idea is we drive a tough bargain and we get what we want and they get what they want. Well, we need to do the same thing with housing, right? We need to, how much money do we give state governments in infrastructure every year? Well, you don't build houses, you don't get the bridges, the roads, the train systems, all the other things that you want, right? That's the kind of, we just got to dial everything up, I think I would say.
Well, that's what they haven't done. They've offered to pay for houses, but that hasn't been successful. So I think you've got to look for stronger measures, and that's where a federal supply policy would come in. Additionally, I think you've got to use the position that you have to ensure that local governments feel the pressure of the Commonwealth and potentially the state as well, if it's on board, that if it's going to deny development, then it is going to be under pressure. Because I feel that the more I look at these cases where large developments, particularly apartment buildings, which would be providing entry-level housing for people in some parts of the world, it's a risk-free thing for them. They capitulate to NIMBYism and people who send in submissions and have time to go to the public meetings, which is a small subset of the community. And so they buy off these people by denying the development, and then there's no pressure. So sure, there's this new YIMBY movement, which is good, but that's all. So the government can do more here, can't it, to use its platform?
Yes. And I think that this is not new, or this is not an isolated example. I mean, there are many examples of this exact problem in every policy area you can think of, right? Where there's individual interests and they don't align with the social interest. I mean, that's like the purpose of government, right? Like that's the number one job, is to overcome those individual interests, and we're not doing it. Now, it's worth at this point just saying two things. I mean, I've heard something that has impressed me. I listened to your podcast on The Guardian recently, and I was like, and a lot of economists are going, hallelujah, someone's talking about the actual problem, which is supply. Right now, I heard an ABC journalist last week on a podcast say something to the effect of, there's no silver bullet. We got to do everything. And I thought to myself, no, there's a silver bullet, and it's called supply.
Yeah.
This is actually one area of government policy where we have a silver bullet. If you look at Auckland, right? They had a big housing regulation overhaul, and it has made houses affordable, like that, overnight, right? You look here in the US at places like Houston or places like Austin. Is you look at locations with this terrible housing regulations that restrict people's ability to build, house prices go through the roof. If you look at places where they don't have the restrictions, house prices don't go through the roof. We genuinely have a silver bullet, right? People talk about negative gearing and capital gains tax and yada, 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 first home buyer grants, blah, blah. Supply.
Yeah.
The answer is supply. So any government policy that doesn't meaningfully address the supply question is not, in my mind, meaningfully addressing, housing.
Yeah, and obviously, if you had the ability constitutionally to deal with local governments, then it would be easier to solve.
Sure.
I see that in New Zealand, they've just announced that they will tie GST allocations to councils meeting housing targets, right? Fantastic. Sure. But our constitution doesn't allow that. We have a more complicated, we have a more like a US style system. So we need to think about how we might be able to do that. But as I say, I think there are policies and there are laws, and there is a pressure you can apply in the positions that you hold. And so I think that the councils in many cases are getting away with murder, frankly. Now the other
just say this. Can I just jump in, Andrew, with one point? I think this is important to quickly mention. So the other thing is, I think people there's a lot of scapegoats in this area of policy. So there's a lot of things that people blame the issue on. And there's a lot of supply denialism out there. Okay. So there's a lot of people out there who supply, I hear this from the Greens, for example, frequently, like that supply is not going to affect the price of housing at all. And I have to just be honest, like, we have crystal clear evidence about which there is zero doubt that it genuinely makes the difference, right? And it is the reason housing is not affordable. But the other thing that's worth mentioning, I think, is so it's a silver bullet in the sense that the reason housing is expensive is because we've limited supply. But people also need to have in their mind some degree of reasonableness, because it's simply unrealistic to expect I'll give you one example. If you imagine, if your parents owned a house, so people our age, who are looking at like getting into the housing market or recently gone into the housing market, if they imagine if their parents owned a home when they were younger, it is unrealistic to expect to have exactly what your parents had when they were younger at this point. And that's because the Australian population has doubled in the last 50 years. And we haven't doubled the number of cities. We haven't doubled the size of our cities. So, if you think about like the North Shore of Sydney or something, go back 50 years, you could get a 4-bedroom detached house with a big block of land and your kids could run out in the backyard. If you want that, you can't have it anymore for the same price. And that's just a fact, right? So what comes, like, that's that's just the fact of the world, right? If you want to go to the Acropolis in Greece that I went to this summer holidays, it's going to be busier now than it was 50 years ago. That's a fact of life, right? So I think what we need to recognize is population grows. It grows. That's the way it goes. It's good for our economy, but it means that policy has to respond and do what it can to kind of minimize the costs of that, which means maybe building more apartments near train stations or densifying in certain areas, and then that will help house prices, where there are big yards and lots of space, right? I think we've got to be realistic about our expectations and understand, what levers are available to us and what makes a real difference. So I'm sorry to kind of go on, but I feel like that's an important thing for people to understand.
No, I think it is important. So what do you think would be the most important supply policies for us to have at the next election? I mean, speaking generally, if you were looking at all the parties in a neutral, generic way, what are the best supply policies for us to have? Are they the ones that coerce the councils, or are they something else?
Yes. I think you've got to think about a few things. One, definitely zoning and permits. That sort of general category of things, and that includes heritage listing. An umbrella of things that deal with local regulations restricting housing. That's the number one. I don't know a single credible, top economist. I think of all of the ones I know, they all agree, right? So, and the question is, what's the mechanism? And I think we've talked a little bit about this, like some kind of big, massive financial incentive, a bit of stick, a bit of carrot, whatever, to just force it to happen. So that's number one. Number two is, a big part of the reason that houses aren't being built in Australia is because the cost of inputs has gone up a lot. And that's not just materials, although materials are a big part, but materials have come back down as supply has expanded. But it's the cost of labor, the availability and cost of skilled labor is really important, right? And I'll tell you two ways in which this matters. One, federal government spending federal and state government spending is drawing a massive amount of skilled construction workers into its, orbit, and away from building houses. Ask anyone who's building a house in Australia, you cannot get someone to do it, right? And so that's an example where federal government spending is crowding out private spending, and where more restraint at the federal level and the state level would have reduced inflationary pressures. Bingo, that's right there, right? And the other question is immigration. So we need to boost the number of skilled tradespeople that we bring in through immigration. However you do it, right? Make sure they're on the skills list. Make sure we incentivize them. Do whatever we can to get those people in to build the houses that we need, and reduce pressure on that market generally. So I think that's number two. How we can impact the actual physical cost of building the houses. I think that's a big constraint. I know your party has an immigration policy that it's kind of partly announced and is working on. I would say prioritizing people who can build houses in that list, and we haven't got detail of the government's policy on this either, like critical, right? So that's another thing I think the government can do. And then the third thing I would say is, then we could, after we've got those two sorted out, then we could talk about, other policies to deal with, first home buyers, housing affordability. And I know you guys have the super policy, for example, that is designed to make it, frankly, fairer, right? For people getting access to financing to buy a home. So I would say those three kind of things. If I saw a government propose that or an opposition propose that, it would get a big tick from me.
Well, I think we'll be hopefully pretty close to that. Now, I want to ask you as well about the corporate housing issue, because I think you probably have a unique perspective living in the US. So effectively, I mean, my critique, may not be your critique, but my critique of a lot of Labor's policy on housing is that it's calibrated to support the aspirations of fund managers and big institutional pension funds or super funds, as we call them here, as you know, to provide housing supply, which I think is a bit of a warped kind of priority. What is it like in the US? Because we hear a lot that towns like Jacksonville and Atlanta have a high level of corporate housing. Is that something that you've observed in your time in the US?
Yeah. So, look, it is definitely more common. There's no doubt about that. And there's various reasons for that. Tax reasons. There's all sorts of reasons why it is more corporatized in the US. It's certainly a lot less personal. And I think for a renter, I mean, this could cut either way, I suppose, but it's certainly less personal for a renter in the sense that you don't necessarily have a person on the other end of the kind of relationship. If you want to, if you want to get your oven fixed because it stopped working, dealing with this gigantic bureaucracy can be kind of a nightmare,
BlackRock,
right?
do you?
So, yeah. But I would say so if we're thinking about one hand, the other hand, more investment in the housing market. I think people have a sense that more investment in the housing market could be good in the sense that it could lower the kind of, it could actually make things cheaper, right? So, but the trouble is, if you get this big surge of investment in housing with a fixed supply constraint, it leads to prices going up, right? So I think the question is like, again, I hate to be a broken record, Andrew, but if you want to get this, like the problem with housing is not that too few people want to buy houses. It's like, we don't need a policy that says, hey, let's get people to buy houses, right?
Yeah.
Like own houses, and rent them out. That's not what we need, right? We don't need more kind of interest in owning houses to rent out. I think the issue is we need more houses to exist, right? So I would argue, having a system that favors, I feel like this is either A, not helping, or 2, is counterproductive in the short run.
Yeah, okay.
And other than that, I don't have a strong view, and I don't know enough about the ins and outs of how that would work, in Australia were it to happen. But I would say that if you think that's the problem we need to solve, like if super funds not owning enough houses is a policy problem, I don't really understand why. For example,
and neither do I.
That makes sense.
That makes two of us. Can I ask you finally then? What is the thing you most miss about Australia?
Oh man, I hate to say this, and I got to be careful about what I say in a public forum. Here's what it is. I miss Australia's best characteristic by a mile is our egalitarianism. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, if you're in Australia and something happens, someone's there to help you out. And I'm a fairly individualistic person. I think, I'm an economist, and among economists, I'm into kind of markets, and I like that, right? But that ignores the social dimension, which is, if I'm in Australia, as soon as I get out of the airport and I drop my keys, someone will pick them up and hand them to you. If I get in a lift, someone will talk to you, have a conversation with you. There is a sense in Australia of everyone, we call it mateship, I guess, but the idea in Australia that we're all in it together. I feel America, relatively speaking, and I've lived here for more than 10 years, is much less, it lacks that. Everything is very impersonal. Everyone is on their own. It feels hostile, right? And I think Australia has managed to generate the system where, we're all in it together. And I think that's so important. And every time I get off the plane, it's like so refreshing. It's like, so I'm going to be there in a few weeks, and I can't wait. Even when you get on the plane, if you fly Qantas, you feel it as soon as you get on the plane.
Yeah,
the way the flight attendants. The way the flight attendants interact with you, it's like, oh man, these are my people,
Yeah.
So I miss that.
Well,
I miss that a lot.
I thought you were going to say a Vegemite sandwich, but egalitarianism is also.
I have so much Vegemite. I bring back at huge stocks of Vegemite, because here you can buy it here, but it's like crazy expensive. So I buy these. I always go to Coles before I leave, and I buy these massive, and Allen's party mix, which I got to be honest, like. The lolly situation in the US is just dire, Anyway.
Well, that's a very good answer. Thank you very much for your time today, Steve. You are a doyen of economics and a breath of fresh air. So we will take your policy advice into our consideration, of course, and thank you for your frank and fearless advice today.
Yeah, and keep up the good work, Andrew. I really, I'm very, I know a lot of economists have the same view. Very happy, to see you out there saying the right things on housing. So, I think it's terrific.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
See you, mate.